Welcome to another introduction video of TEST.easy. In this video I will give you a brief overview over our test automation tool for SAP. My name is Lukas Briel and I'm a developer at TEST.easy. If you are new to TEST.easy, I recommend you check out our previous videos. I assume by now you know how to create, configure and execute a test case with a test object and a result model. In this video, we will continue working on the example test case we've been building up previously. In the last video, we configured a validation rule that checks the amount of the document's line items. This works just fine because the document we created has two line items with the same amount, one on the debit side and one on the credit side. This field is the indicator for whether this line item is on the credit or the debit side. I will now add a validation rule that checks if the line item is on the debit side, which of course will be true for one line item but false for the other. Let's execute the test case anyway and check the run protocol. This button lets us view where the test scenario is being used. That way we can jump right into the test set we created for this scenario and execute it again. Indeed, the test case failed. Before we look at the exact validation rule that failed, let's first turn our attention to the tree on the left side. Here we see a little table symbol indicating that this test case produced a table of messages. The other table symbol we can see right now is from the header table of our database model in the results section. The status column tells us that the cause of the failed test case is on a lower level of that table. But before we dig deeper into that, let's have a look on the messages table node. When we expand the table node, we see the first child node is called cardinality, which basically just tells you how many lines are in that table compared to how many lines were expected. In the column for the actual values, we see that this table has two entries, which is easy to see in this example when you look at the remaining child nodes of that table. The expected value for the cardinality says :****. You can disregard that single in front of the colon for the moment. Just note that this is a certain kind of option you can configure. The number of expected entries is shown after the colon. The star symbol stands for an arbitrary number. Therefore, this cardinality check was passed. This is the default configuration for any table in the output or the result. Now let's dig a little deeper into the cause of our failed test case. Expanding the header table of our database model, we see its cardinality check, which tells us there's just one entry. Underneath, we can look into that one table entry, but instead of immediately showing the entry's data, we see another child node with an index 1. Only after expanding this one, we can see the validation rules and the actual values. This is because this set of validation rules, including everything further down from here, forms a so-called validation group. And this is what this symbol stands for. Expanding the whole subtree, we find the cause of our failed test case, which is, as we expected, the new validation rule checking that the line item is on the debit side. This fails for the second line item, which is on the credit side. We also recognize the same pattern for every table in the output or results section. Each table entry is being validated by a specific validation group. TEST.easy provides just one validation group per table by default. That is why we always see that index 1. However, we can define additional validation groups for any table. Furthermore, each validation group lets us define specific conditions that must be met by the test data in order for it to be validated. And that exactly is what we are aiming for in this video. We can avoid the error we've got here by defining a validation group that is only applied to the debit side of our line items, And for the sake of completeness, we will define a second validation group for the line items table that will be only applied to the credit side. Back in the scenario application, we can recognize each validation group we already have by the field group condition. Just as we've seen in the protocol tree, each table in the output or results section has one validation group by default. Let's open the validation group dialog. At the top, we see the technical name of this validation group and right next to it, the description. Let's change that into something that shows at first glance what we're validating here. The group option controls the way nested validation groups are handled. For this example, the default option single will suffice. The field multiplicity lets you define how many hits for this validation group you expect. If more or less table entries meet the validation group criteria, the test run will fail. We know how many line items on the debit side to expect, only one. However, note that beside the star symbol for arbitrary numbers and any specific number, we can also define ranges in order to handle some degree of uncertainty. So we can give a lower and an upper bound separated by two dots. In our case, however, we expect exactly one line item on the debit side. In the middle area, we can define conditions or criteria on the data for this validation group. We create a new entry and can choose from all the fields of the current table structure. So we define the condition that this validation group should only be applied to line items where the indicator field says it's on the debit side. When we close the dialog, we see an updated heading and the field group condition summarizes the constraints we just defined. Now we're going to need another validation group for the credit side. We open up the dialog again and click the copy button at the top. Note that now there is an additional delete button, because now we have created a second validation group for this table, and TEST.easy allows us to delete validation groups as long as there's at least another one left. Now we are going to modify this copy for validation on the credit side. After closing the dialog, we can see two validation groups for the line items table. Not only did we copy the group conditions of that validation group, but also all validation rules within that group. So what's left to do now is to modify the actual validation rule, checking for the debit side. Executing this test case should now result in a successful test run. Let's check. The test case was successful. Let's look into the protocol tree for details. We see that the check for the credit side only applied for the credit side, and accordingly, the check for the debit side only applied for the debit side. Note that the indices in the tree also indicate that different validation groups were used for each data entry in the line item table. That concludes today's video, and I hope I was able to give you some new insight into TEST.easy and its validation groups.